Good morning, everybody. My name is Toby Fife. I'm the editor of this sterling publication, Canadian Government Executive Magazine. And along with the magazine, if you like, myself and IBM, I want to thank you very much for coming to this executive briefing. Today we're going to explore the potentials and the pitfalls for governments of cloud computing. We have three presenters who will explore this topic before we open the floor to questions, and I hope some dialogue from all of you. Essentially, we're posing three questions. The first is, what exactly do we mean by the term? There's no question it's being thrown around and used a lot now, so what exactly does it mean? Second, how can governments leverage its advantages while minimizing its risks? And third, what's the best way for governments to move forward? A 2008 Pew Internet study defined the cloud as an emerging architecture by which data and applications reside in cyberspace, allowing users to access them through any web-connected drive. So of course that means that my wife can access using the iCloud, can access her photos on her iPhone 5, a purchase, by the way, that I think got me one step closer to heaven. But all that, of course, assumes she can reach the net. And what does it mean for governments, their employees, and the citizens they serve? Well, proponents say the cloud will improve service to citizens by simplifying accessibility, again, assuming they have access. It will cut back, they say, on the need for IT infrastructure. For public servants, it will facilitate real-time work and collaboration, and it will save money by consolidating facilities and budgets. And the risks? Well, both Ontario and the Federal Privacy Commissioners have raised concerns about the cloud, including issues related to the ownership and creation of data, data permanence and ownership, and data intrusions, and some issues around security and privacy. And of course, for governments, there's always the how question when it comes to getting there. Budgets are tight, the appetites for big projects is weak, and what is the business proposition? Should governments use the private sector, the public sector, a hybrid model? And finally, to what degree can the cloud support the transformation of government as we move to smaller, more agile, and more focused public administration? So that kind of sets the stage, perhaps, for our three speakers. And let me introduce them to you. The first on my right is Michael Sylvia from the IBM Office of the CIO. Michael is an IBM Distinguished Engineer and the Director of the Advanced Technologies Group in the Office of the IBM CIO. Among the initiatives Michael is currently leading is the application of cloud computing and storage optimization inside IBM. Michael is an advisor on infrastructure technical trends and directions to IBM CIO and is currently responsible for IBM's internal technical cloud strategy and deployment. He has over 20 years industry experience and is an information technology professional with broad substantive skills and experience in the design and delivery of complex IT solutions and in technical community leadership. In April 2000, the IBM Corporate Technology Council named him an IBM Distinguished Engineer, and he was elected to the IBM Academy of Technology in the same year. Our second speaker on my right is Dr. Samantha Alisio, Corporate Chief Strategist for the Government of Ontario. In this position since 1910, she leads the 1910. 2010. Samantha and I had a discussion about this, and we agreed that she has aged very well. She leads the alignment of information and IT strategy, policy, and technology with government priorities and direction. She provides leadership in IT strategic planning, policy development, enterprise architecture, and control. Her division publishes the major project report quarterly and the annual IT corporate performance report. Previously, Samantha was the Chief Information Officer with the Central Agency's Information and IT Cluster. As CIO, she delivered key initiatives, including the Ontario Newsroom, Infrastructure Tracking Portal, Ontario Taxes Online, and she launched one of the first public sector telework projects. Our third speaker is Jeff Braybrook, President of Blueprint Incorporated. Before forming the company, Jeff was Deputy Chief Technology Officer for the Government of Canada. When there, he provided guidance, oversight, and strategic direction for the common look and feel standards for the Internet. He founded and chaired the Web Managers Council, an interdepartmental advisory body. He piloted and launched the federal government-wide blog, the GCpedia Wiki, and a professional networking platform for the federal public service. He developed and published government-wide policy guidelines for Web 2.0 and social media. Prior to joining the government, he had sales and client relationship management roles at CGI and at Xerox Canada. So, you know the guests. You don't know their ages, although you may have tried to guess. Just kidding. And here's the format. Each speaker will make a presentation, and then afterward we will open the floor to questions and discussions that I will moderate. So, may I ask Michael if he would start? Thank you very much for coming, sir.
Thank you. Delighted to be here today. I want to share with you a few of IBM's own experiences with the use of cloud computing. We began to use cloud in IBM far back as 2008, in some areas even a little bit earlier than that. We've been working at it pretty intently since. And from that, I think we've learned a lot of things about this as a model, where its advantages are, benefits, et cetera, and some of the considerations as well. What I'd like to do is to talk to you about what is cloud. As Toby said, a lot of confusion about that. You may have noticed there's just a little bit of hype around cloud, so I'd like to try to help you understand what I think most people in the IT business are now sort of focusing on and converging on as a definition of cloud in some level. What some of the value, benefits, and considerations are around cloud computing, and then where, from my experience, from IBM's own internal experience, where we see cloud computing going in the future and the opportunities that it'll bring for you, and again, some of the considerations. If you were to think about what cloud computing is, one of the things I can tell you is it often, with all the hype that's going on, it often gets confused with something that's been around for a while, quite effectively, the Internet. And yet, cloud computing, while it often works on the Internet, is not in and of itself the Internet. It really is a model for computing, for consuming, and providing IT that often works with the Internet, but not necessarily. And I think one of the best definitions that I've seen is, and the one that in some fashion or another, either directly or indirectly, shows up in most people's minds who are working in this business now, is the one that had been put up by the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, the NIST organization. Let me kind of take you through it, because this I think is sort of fundamental to the definition of cloud computing. Cloud computing is a model for enabling convenient network access to a shared pool of resources, and those resources can be things like networks, servers, storage, etc. I think the things that we often think of are applications, like a Salesforce.com, or something that's more focused on government, or they are infrastructure, raw storage, or servers that are available to you over the Internet. So those are available on demand. They can also be rapidly provisioned or deprovisioned, released, essentially, given back. And all of that can be done without you and I having to deal with a bunch of humans to do that for us. So that, in a nutshell, really is what most of us think cloud computing is in some fashion or another. Those resources, again, can be an assortment of things. There are certain resources that are a little more dominant today available in the cloud computing industry. But they even include things that aren't necessarily in that definition, like virtual phone services as well. So let's dig just a little bit deeper. The way that this is delivered is really in 4 different service models, 2 of which are very predominant today, 2 of which are beginning to grow. The 2 that are most predominant are the ones that are on the left side of this chart. Software as a service is something that's been around as application as a service, I suppose, for a while. Things like, again, Salesforce.com, maybe an email service that you might acquire for your organization's use easily, quickly, over the Internet. These are very popular, very focused usually. They provide a particular function and they're available pretty much on demand. If you were to look at the next lower left corner there, the second largest segment of cloud computing that is used today, and it's infrastructure as a service. And this would be things like IBM's own smart cloud offerings, certainly what I would term more the credit card clouds like Amazon and so forth. These are the people that are providing you some raw resource like a server or some amount of storage that's easily configurable, easily acquired, and in most cases I don't have to provide any sort of upfront investment to get a hold of that. The two that are growing are the ones that are on the right side. Lower right quadrant, platform as a service. This is a set of shared development tools, other sorts of applications that are easily accessible, and this is a growing segment. It's probably the third largest at this point. And then in the upper right, business process as a service, another type of service that is becoming more predominant, and I expect to grow considerably over the next few years. And this would be things that are very focused on particular business processes, whether those be for government or for commercial purposes. You don't have to have all four of these to be a user of cloud computing. And they aren't necessarily put together, although they sometimes are. Meaning, for example, I might have a software as a service that's delivered on top of some resources that I acquired from an infrastructure as a service provider, but I don't necessarily have to. Let's take a look at the types of deployment options. A lot of people associate the cloud computing with the internet, with what has now become known as public cloud. And this is a case where I can acquire either an application as a software as a service or an infrastructure as a service kind of resource, and it's available to me via the internet. Okay? Public cloud. And there's a lot of things and a lot of good positive things that come with that. The biggest being that generally they're quite inexpensive to acquire, but there are also some considerations. As Toby mentioned, certainly some of the things like security are a consideration when you're using a service provided by somebody who knows where, and as well, you don't know much about what's between you and them as well. On top of some resources that I acquired from an infrastructure as a service provider, but I don't necessarily have to. Let's take a look at the types of deployment options. A lot of people associate the cloud computing with the internet, with what has now become known as public cloud. And this is a case where I can acquire either an application as a software as a service or an infrastructure as a service kind of resource, and it's available to me via the internet. Okay? Public cloud. And there's a lot of things and a lot of good positive things that come with that. The biggest being that generally they're quite inexpensive to acquire, but there are also some considerations. As Toby mentioned, certainly some of the things like security are a consideration when you're using a service provided by somebody who knows where, and as well, you don't know much about what's between you and them as well. What has happened is a lot of people said, this is a really great model. I like it, but I want to put it someplace that I trust more. Like I want to put it in my own data center. So I want to do the same sorts of things, provide the same way to get to these, and then move those to my own data center. And with that came the birth of the so-called private cloud computing. It's really just the same model, just put in a safer place on my own data center. And that's also great, except one of the disadvantages of that is I still have to operate it, which I may really not like to do. And I might much prefer the cloud computing model that is, say, a public cloud, where somebody else provides it and I consume it, or my organization simply consumes it. And with that, we've started to see the growth of some other models, like you see now, that are kind of between those two bookends. So these are models where moving kind of right or left to right, where vendors may in fact operate them on your own data center, or may in fact operate them for you, and yet they're still behind your firewall. So the first three all represent some variant of a private cloud. They have the protections of a private cloud without the
without necessarily that I'm going to operate them. And then the other variant is second from the right, is where public cloud providers have started to provide certain abilities for you to get isolated bits and pieces that are important to you from, say, your own security considerations. So there are a lot of different ways to deploy this now. So when somebody says, I want to use the cloud, in some ways it's gotten richer for you, but it also has some considerations that may have made it just a little bit more complicated. Just some general observations. If you're using public cloud on the far right, again, big advantage is usually cost, because the way these providers make this work is they aggregate a lot of resources and make it available to a lot of users and get an economy of scale in that. Public cloud, a private cloud, has the advantage of the isolation, the security, a lot of those considerations, but just to be upfront, you probably can't get it as cheaply as you can get the resources on the far right. And then again, the far right may not meet your needs because of the security considerations. So what are the benefits of clouds? In a nutshell, if I'm a consumer of a cloud, at a very, very high level, there's really two things that kind of pop up with cloud computing. One is the cost, and that in the current environment, that seems to be the big focus that everybody is looking at. But the second is some amount of flexibility. That ability to get those resources quickly, or even get those resources at all, when I don't have to go out and get capital, I don't have to get floor space, people to operate, and all that sort of stuff. That provides me a technical flexibility I haven't had before. And that may well, in fact, provide me some ability as a business entity to do some things I couldn't do before. So let's kind of look at some of the other benefits available for cloud. I mentioned cost optimization certainly being one, and flexibility, but there are some others. One is typically in a cloud model, I don't have any capital expenditure up front, and that has a lot of appeal, obviously, in the right place. It may also be a lot of the cloud providers provide those services on a pay-per-use basis. Now, you may have noticed when I showed you the definition from the US NIST at the beginning, there was no mention of that. It's often associated with cloud, but pay-per-use is not necessarily, it's common, but not necessarily part of what's required to have it. And there are advantages and disadvantages to that. If you're running a large, ongoing IT operation, sometimes you want to have a known fixed cost quantity and not necessarily have to rent. And for the same reasons that you sometimes lease a car and sometimes buy a car, there are obviously use case considerations in each of those. Some of the other things that are clearly benefits, the ability to do things so much faster can allow you to improve some processes. And with that, you may in fact be able to get to do some things that you need to do much faster to react to certain events that you need to provide some IT to support them with. And then the other thing is simplification and standardization. The previous chart, I didn't spend a lot of time on how the providers provide those things, but one of the things they do is these are not custom homes. These are, the cloud offerings are normally somewhat simplified and standardized. So you have to tailor a little bit what you want to do to fit into that. Now there's obviously pluses and minuses to that. As IT people, we generally have worked in a world where we often tailor everything. And with the cloud world, if you want to take advantage of it, you probably have to find a happy medium there somewhere. From a consideration standpoint, well, there's sort of the big five fundamentals. You know, particularly for public clouds, we have to consider security and compliance kind of considerations. But other things that you really have to look at as you look at a cloud provider, whether you're going to provide that or somebody else, include, does it have the service and support that you need for your applications? Does it have the availability or support the availability? Can you get a guarantee on a certain level of availability? Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Will it provide the performance that you want? If I stick something on the other side of the world, that may be a great thing from a cost standpoint, and it may be an acceptable thing. But if I have stringent performance requirements, I may need to have a little more control over some of those. And then the whole financial model, as I mentioned, may or may not work depending upon your particular situation. Renting, for example, if that's the offering, may not be the better choice versus some fixed kind of thing. The other thing that is, I think, really important as you look at the internet is, with all the hype, one of the things that sort of got lost is that it's really no different than any other model from the standpoint that it works really well for some things, and in fact better for a lot of things than traditional hosting has done, traditional computing, but it doesn't necessarily work as well for everything. So it really is workload dependent. You really need to know your work, know whether cloud is the right match for you. The other thing is, as a part of that, is as you begin to use and consume cloud computing as a model, your applications may need to change. And the way you actually produce those and the way they react to certain things may have to be a little different in order to work best with cloud computing. The other thing is that, and I'm a huge advocate of cloud, but I would be somebody you should be afraid of if I told you everything's going to cloud computing in the near future. Traditional hosting, traditional information technology will continue alongside the expanding and growing area of cloud computing. And then lastly, I think, cloud computing is not rocket science, but it is computer science. And so again, if I have a database that requires really important security and performance, and I go to a cloud computing vendor and I quickly acquire it, have no idea where it is, it turns out it's on the other side of the world with very poor network links, guess what? Just as if you and I put that combination together in the real world, traditional world, it's not going to work very well. So the principles of computer science still come into play when you get past all the vapor that is cloud computing. Just a little bit about IBM's own experience with cloud. We've had 7 different activities that we've had a lot of different experience with. Two of the 7 that have been best for us have been the 2 you see here. Development and test space, we've had tremendous success with that. We've stood up a series of clouds that are used by our developers that support the applications that run the business of IBM as a business, just as you run your government. And the second one is in the area of analytics. We provide an analytic capability over more than a petabyte versus federated data. And by doing so, we've eliminated a whole bunch of disjointed applications and disjointed user interfaces that we've had in the past. And we've enabled people to do some things they hadn't thought of before with some analytic tools. That one saved us a lot of money, and the other one has saved us a lot of time and some money, the development and test. 5 other areas that we've had good experience with. Collaboration. We've got a smart cloud meetings capability and an assortment of sort of business versions of social computing. We have had some experience with moving some of our production workload into cloud. We've had very good experience with self-service applications. We've provided a forms-based application that tool allows people who have no knowledge at all of application development to quickly produce forms-based applications that can be used across the company. We've had very good experience with storage, tremendous value from both our file and block storage kind of environments, where we've done an assortment of things, including automated tiering, that have both increased our functionality and saved us a lot of money. And we've had some good experiences with certain users in using virtual desktop technology. From that, we've sort of developed
I think you're scared.
We've developed a plan, a roadmap for our own use of cloud computing, which I think you can hopefully find some value from that. In last year, we spent a lot of time kind of expanding that base of those 7 different areas that we had, including adding that self-service application environment, forms-based application tools. Where we are at now in 2012 is really trying to evolve and adopt more use of cloud computing. two major focus areas within that. One is, as I said earlier, if you're going to use cloud computing and use it extensively and get the most benefits, you may actually have to go through an application transformation of a bit. You may have to look at transforming some of your applications to better operate within the cloud environment. And that's one of the things we're focusing on now in order to expand our reach beyond some of the successes that I showed you on the previous chart. Next big area we're focusing on is moving, if you think back to that chart I had of the 5 different deployment models, it had public, pure public on the right side and pure private on the other. We're kind of in that private area over here, most of our clouds that I showed you in the previous one. We want to move those into versions that we're using somebody else to actually provide that cloud, whether that's a hosted private kind of an operation like one of those that I showed you that's in the middle, or whether that's a public provider. Because the CIO wants to slowly get out of the business of being a provider of its own information technology where that makes sense. So those are two big focuses we currently have in 2012. Going forward, we see cloud computing is going to be a predominant mechanism for us to provide and consume IT going forward. We see that it's going to increasingly take more and more of how we're using it inside IBM. We also think that, as I said, we're going to slowly evolve to using more and more service providers to do that. And as we do that, the role of the CIO and the CIO's technical services, like those of my team, will change from being the people who design the information technology that we run the company on to those who will be more of a broker and a consultant on where's the right place to put it, the right cloud service, the right type of service model, et cetera, that makes sense. So it'll actually kind of transform our own role over time. So what do I see as the future? As I said, cloud will definitely be a predominant mechanism for both delivering and consuming IT going forward, and yet, as I also said, traditional information technology is not going to go away. I do think we'll get to a point, and a lot of people predict we're about 50% of large enterprise information technology will be provided through some form of cloud computing in the next few years, out to about 2015. The other thing is cloud computing will be both public and private. And in fact, most of the industry analysts that I read suggest, and this goes pretty much with our own experience and projections internally, that about 50% of computing we provide by cloud computing by 2015, of that 50, 35 of the 50 will be private cloud computing, and 15 of the balance here will be in public cloud. So private cloud is a major mechanism. So you want to think back to that previous chart I had, find some niche in there that makes sense for most of your use of cloud computing. Adoption of cloud by service models will change. I had those 4 up there that I showed you. As I indicated, some of those, like business process and platform as a service, I think will become larger growth areas over time. Application portfolios, again, will need to and should evolve to becoming more cloud-centric over time. And I think your mileage may vary. The adoption pattern that works for the IBM Corporation will be very different from how it works for you, and yours may work very different from other enterprises. And small may be different than large. So cloud computing, I think, while it will continue to be adopted in significant levels going forward, will vary a lot depending upon your particular enterprise and its requirements. Lastly, I think cloud computing today is already transforming how IT is delivered, particularly in the ability to get resources like raw resources like servers and storage and that sort of thing quickly. It absolutely can transform how our business is managed. Our own business analytics cloud is a good example of that. We're able to operate the business of IBM differently by using this easily acquired, easily used, rapidly configured application tool to do analytic capability that we didn't have before. And we're actually transforming how IBM is managed as a result of that. The real key will be, and cloud will really be reaching a level of maturity when we get to that last point, where we are actually transforming how business is conducted. And I'm not seeing a lot of that yet, but I think that that will really be, that will be certainly something that we should be looking towards for great advantage in the future. That's what I wanted to talk to you about, a brief introduction. I hope that had some value. Thank you.
I'm going to try and kind of leave you with a few thoughts in terms of what your dilemma is, what your opportunity is. From the point of view, I think everybody in this room is involved in some way in trying to make a decision on how they bring the best of technology to their organization, whether you're in a business line area or you're actually in IMIT in some way. And we should start off with the fact that I was reading a survey, and I don't want to quote the number, but because I can't remember the source, but I was reading about a number of people have been surveyed, and it's a very high number. Everybody comes, whether they're vendors or service providers nowadays, a lot of the sales folks use cloud incessantly, and it doesn't mean they're offering one. So maybe we'll just take a few minutes and go through and say, center back in some of the things Mike talked about in terms of what is the cloud, and by example saying what isn't the cloud. But first I want to start with the whole federal landscape. You've probably heard some of the news from Tony Clement and that over the last 12 months about this very ambitious consolidation of IT services by the federal government and a brand new department called Shared Services Canada. So let's talk about the roles that people play, and I'm going to assume just about everybody in this room plays the role of, I'm actually in a ministry or a department, and I'm trying to figure out who's my service provider, what do I do myself, what can I use in the cloud, and what really isn't the cloud. So the Treasury Board itself, and I should say Secretariat, that's a little bit of a typo, is the management board for over 100 departments and agencies, and they set strategic direction and policy from the point of view of IM, IT, and security, a few other things, but fundamentally in that area around the whole space that would touch cloud or computing. They are very much encouraging this idea of clusters. A few years back, there was this shared services idea. It was part of Public Works and Government Services, and they wanted to make that where people would primarily go get their IT rather than doing it in their department 100 different times in 100 different ways. Whole of government thinking isn't really great in a Westminster system. Ontario and Canada aren't that different in that the accountability for your ministry, your department, lies within the head of your department. The money, the mandate, and all of that, and the role, and fulfilling that mission. Very hard to get whole of government thinking. I'll tell you from experience, started something called GCpedia, you may or may not have heard of, but it's a wiki and that for the, to get people thinking horizontally across departments and agencies and regions across this country, and just being a lot smarter about the way they do common things and knowing that they're doing things in common. Very, very difficult to get funding for that. It was easy for a department to go get $1 million to get their own wiki, but very hard to get everybody to participate in that, even though people said it was for the common good. So that's just a reality, and that's not really going to change much. So the question is, what's the role of the department versus these central agencies? And I'll talk about the federal for a moment. So Treasury Board is trying to encourage that behavior. So they've backed off a little bit on that and said, when it comes to application service providers like finance, HR, those sort of things, PeopleSoft, what have you, they're encouraging people to find a friend. So does somebody want to cluster and be the host for that application? In the meantime, we have this brand new organization called Shared Services Canada, which is supposed to consolidate hundreds of data centers down to a few, and hundreds and hundreds of email systems down to one. Also telecom networks. They have that mandate. They've been given the money, the political will, the people, and what have you. They're starting with an initial 43 departments. So the departments now are supposed to, the IT, the CIOs are supposed to focus on their mandated programs and delivering the best to them. the whole issue of the cloud and private-public sector all share this issue has to do with whoever my hosting provider is. We have very, very strict privacy laws in Canada. We all, in fact, to the degree where if you think of your tax return, there's a checkbox on your tax return because of our privacy laws that says, is it okay if CRA shares your, some of your information with Elections Canada? You have to check that box because the government's not allowed to share across departments and for any other use than they promised you they were going to use it for. It's that strict. You'd be surprised how many people won't check that box. So people feel that's important to them. The idea of sovereignty of data and what doesn't reside in Canada, as Samantha pointed out, is a big deal. It is stopping people from making all kinds of choices in terms of hosting decisions and what have you, including the private sector. All the studies show that the private sector in Canada has a much lower adoption rate of cloud than in the United States. It's because of privacy laws and them not being sure of their risk. So it's not just you in government. So there's this theme coming out that the government of Canada needs to create a policy on cloud computing that delineates and said what those issues and what the risks are, and that may be what needs to happen. So for a moment, let's just talk about the attributes of the cloud. Mike's covered this, he had a much better looking slide, but the Gartner defines it to have these 5 attributes. And it's important, and why am I reviewing it again? Because many people will tell you they're cloud and they're not. This is fundamentally completely different than standard hosting provision. In fact, Mike brought up one of them. If somebody says lots of capital, that's a giveaway. If somebody says multi-year commitment, that's another giveaway, right? It's not that you shouldn't use them. It's not that, I don't know, Shared Services Canada isn't going to provide the hosted infrastructure for a lot of the departments. They are, and you will. But you are trying to make the best fiscal and operational decision for your ministry or your department. You should know what your procurement strategy is, and does it include the cloud or not? And what are the considerations? So the service has to pretty much be an automated response. I need it, can I have it? I can get it very elastic and scalable means I can use more, but I can also use less or hardly any if I want. Nobody's holding me to a minimum commitment. You're not going to always get all these pure things, but you should be looking for these elements when you're looking at deciding. It's shared to the point where you probably don't know where and how and what infrastructure is required to do that, and you really don't want to care. If you do care, it might not be a cloud, you might be paying for the equipment, right? If I go put one of the most common places in state governments in the US and what have you, by a long shot of adoption of cloud is Gmail. It's going to Gmail, right? I could care less what the server configurations, the infrastructure, all of the platforms under Gmail are. I just want mail to work, right? And so I only want to pay for mail. So am I helping the supplier cost recover all of their equipment or not? Is that built into the price? So in a private cloud, you might not actually, I mean, we're in the infancy of cloud in a lot of ways. It's not that mature. So we say private cloud, but please keep your eye on it to see if it's really looking like it. It gives you the financial flexibility and the startup flexibility of cloud. One of the most amazing things, if you can get something for your ministry or your department that actually really doesn't, it might be, as Samantha talked about, a proof of concept. You can deploy so quickly with that kind of a model versus having to go get vendors, RFPs, somebody build something for you, what have you, and get on that. Maybe it's, you'd be surprised how many government people use Yammer. It'll be interesting to see what's going on with it now that Microsoft's starting to integrate it into their solutions. And a couple of the other things there where it's metered by use and it really is an internet play. You talked about this, so I won't waste time on that slide. So now we'll focus on what is your role in a particular department or ministry from providing IT services. So if you're at the federal government, you're saying, well, now the infrastructure is provided by Shared Services Canada, and all that money and people that I had before is over there, even though some of them still have their same desks and they're still in my department. So we have a role issue, right? So we're coming, you can see where we're heading. This is kind of going to be about, you really want to understand or make it clear in your organization or in the government itself that you're with, what is the governance of these decisions? What decisions can I make as a CIO in a department or ministry? Well, it's going to be business applications today in the federal government are still within the departmental jurisdiction. So where the heck is that line drawn? It's a new organization, Shared Services Canada, and there's still not complete clarity on where the scope goes. They're going to be providing the email system. They're going to provide the infrastructure. And I, as the CIO in a department, I'm responsible for my business applications, but they reside on that infrastructure. So if I want to talk about cloud, do I have to go through them? Do they have a vested interest in retaining and recovering the value of the equipment they just inherited from me, that they're running for me now? So those questions need to be addressed. And how will you work? Will it be a council or a board? So that becomes the question. Now, hopefully this parallels Ontario to some degree, right? But it's one of the most well-known and aggressive consolidation strategies going on today, which is the federal one. You've got big compliance issues on the privacy laws and data sovereignty. But this whole idea of accountability and governance, really, you're going to want clarity on that as you go forward. What can I decide? There might be something you could do just for your own department or ministry that you really don't need to go seek infrastructure for, and it doesn't hurt the infrastructure provider people. Maybe it's something, a group you want to get, you want to try an initial pilot for your line of business area, and you can find a safe area, but you're the same way you do any kind of a privacy impact assessment for anything that's public facing now, you're going to have to do it for the cloud anyway, because you're actually going on an outside service. Here's an example, and I'm giving you this for a reason. This is where Shared Services Canada have put through MERX. They're undertaking a process now to find out who's going to provide the email system and how. It talks about either a managed service provider or full outsource. So it doesn't say cloud. However, over the last hour, we've talked about the same fundamental issues exist about privacy, data sovereignty. This is straight out of the slide deck from the industry day, from the requirement that's been put out as the minimum requirement for outside hosted service for the email for the government of Canada. All data are the property of the government of Canada. The spender would have to agree to this. And keeping in mind, as we go through this list, that when a true cloud service hardly ever agrees to your terms and conditions. All infrastructure has to reside in Canada. The servers, the repositories, offsite storage, in secure locations that are approved, all internal emails from government issued anywhere from a Canadian or abroad to other government users can't take hops, they have to be in secure networks, they can't travel through the States and come back, have to be fully encrypted, no data in transit is ever saved or stored between the starting and end point. You have to have access controls and monitors, and the government has to be able to go do the access controls and monitors if they want, and there's absolutely no limitation of liability in the event of a security breach. In other words, you go after that, the host provider, for everything that they're worth and beyond. Now, this, and what isn't on here is that the winning vendor, just about anybody who's involved in this whole email service operationally, has to be a Canadian citizen and fully secret cleared. All employees, right? So, I mean, is this what it's going to be? I think you won't have, and I never said this was a cloud. I just said this is an example of the government saying we need to have that for sure for us to be safe about an offsite provider. Well, I don't know if this is going to stand the test of time for you going out and going on cloud services, because many of those things just hog tie the provider far too much to be able to provide a cost-effective service. So this is going to, and it's going to be an RFP, right? So someone's going to bid to size, which of course flies in the face of the fact that I don't want to care how many servers Google has. In fact, I hope that they have bazillions of them, so I never have to pay hardly anything. And if I use Salesforce.com, you know, it's easy for them to give me something, make a profit, and I'm not paying for their infrastructure, right? So that's really the promise of the cloud, is you get the benefit of economy of scale. So there's lots of opportunities. Open government, open data, some of the things Samantha was talking about, things you want to push out anyway. Do you really have to have them hosted on your systems, or can you not have those things out on somebody else's hosted systems? And it gives you more flexibility for interaction, especially as we move towards, and think about your business folks, all the people that work in your ministry or department that are not IT people, but they've got an iPhone, they've got an iPad, they've got an Android. They would dearly love to be able to be in communication with everybody without having to have a government-issued BlackBerry. So there's opportunity. I mentioned things like citizen relationship management and case management systems because, you know, from my experience in the federal government, I'm sure the provincial governments are that much different. Well over 50% of what you do is really case management. It's approvals, it's grants, it's providing some certificate or some service that has a life cycle to it for the citizen or the business. That's what Salesforce.com does for a living. They do case management, right? It started with client relationship management, but it's moving to things like citizen. If you look at citizenship and immigration, they've got a great big implementation of CBIL. It cost a couple $100 million. I don't know. I mean, could these kind of things, especially for smaller ministries and agencies, be much more agile and meet all of the requirements by going on a hosted service if you can overcome those privacy and data concerns? Right? A back office, I don't know. I mean, payroll, HR, finance, it makes sense structurally and financially, but maybe not privacy-wise, right? So really, I mean, as you move forward, I think the cloud's a force it's going to continue to mature. It has to. It's going to become more attractive, more cost-effective for service delivery. I think it's inevitable, right? And I think we all think that from our daily lives and the things that we do that are non-business, whether it's going onto Facebook, right, using LinkedIn, YouTube, any of those things. We love the fact that that cloud is the engine behind these things. Increasing product and service providers increasingly have a vested interest. Yeah, they'll call it a cloud when it's not a cloud, some of the salespeople, but a lot of them do genuinely have great cloud services to provide. And it's better business for them to have that kind of flexibility to deliver, so they'll continue to make it better. But the concerns of security are a big deal. I think you're going to find that governance is the way forward. How and who makes what decisions around service delivery, whether you can use a cloud or not, some of them you can make without going to a much higher authority because they're modest and the data's safe, right? And it enables something. Others you're going to have to think about. Do you have your central IT, your shared services, and how are you going to together make that decision? Because to some degree, your central shared services may have a vested interest in recovering the cost of the equipment they're providing to you, so they might not want you to go to the cloud. So you have to kind of overcome that little bit of an elephant in the room. But I think better, faster, cheaper is going to be a compelling alternative to this whole idea of everybody working in silos and trying to do IT only for their ministry and only for their department, to give you better approaches to services. So again, summary, it's going to force standardization, which makes you have simpler IT solutions. It's going to let you have faster pilots, and lets you make things as simple as possible without being any simpler, to quote Albert Einstein. But I think too much we try and boil the ocean in the government. So if somebody's saying, I've got this platform, it looks like this, can you conform to it? It actually helps you bring your business people to the table to maybe think outside of, I have to implement this process and I need these features. So I think the cloud's going to bring some promise. I wish you all the best.
Session, I think, from all three of our presenters. Michael giving us an overview of not just what cloud is, but from his perspective, but also some of the options or ways in which governments are going to be able to approach this. Samantha speaking from her experience since 1910, putting together an extremely thorough and approach to how Ontario is approaching this issue, and Jeff giving us some insights from the federal experience, but also raising some really interesting issues around governance and what this will mean for all of us in the public sector. So I'd like to open this to questions. We have lots of time for discussion, and we don't have a microphone, but I don't think we need one in this room. Is there anybody who wants to start? Yes, at the back.
Hello, it's Chris Welcome, Justice in the Ontario government. There's clearly some common themes from the federal government, from the provincial government, and I'm sure that the lower level as well. So my question is there anything happening between the different levels of the government to capitalize on those common needs, to share more, to collaborate more? From the citizen perspective, that's to me a natural next step. The private sector has been doing that 30 years ago. So they're way ahead, and with all of the same concerns, privacy, security, that are common across all of the different levels of the government, to me that seems something like natural next step for all of the governments to start working together more.
That's an interesting question, particularly in the context of some of the issues you've just brought up. Samantha, do you want to start perhaps with that, and then Jeff?
Sure, so I think absolutely. There are a couple of different efforts that I'm aware of that are going on right now across the Public Sector CIO's Council is driving some collaboration initiatives related to data centers. And then as data center starts to think about hosting, I think that'll translate into some kind of government-private cloud opportunities as well. Typically though, when you bring 3 levels of government together, and the municipal sector is included in that too, the decision-making process takes a little bit longer. So I think that's something that we have to kind of balance as well. I think each jurisdiction, you heard from Jeffrey where the federal government's going, and with the Shared Services Canada journey, I think there are going to be some fundamental changes that will happen there quickly. With Ontario's approach around data classification and the RFP that we have around web hosting, that's probably going to happen quickly. And while we're looking at some of that other stuff. So on the data center side, it's Shared Services Canada looking at opportunities across provincial holdings. So where do provinces have data center facilities where we could potentially look at shared hosting opportunities? And that's something, a piece of work that's going on right now. And then opportunities for government-private cloud. What are different jurisdictions doing, and where might that be leverageable across? However, I want to balance that with slightly different approaches. So although the considerations on the surface might seem very similar, Ontario and the federal government, as an example, have a little bit of a different interpretation about the risks associated with data sovereignty. So from an Ontario perspective, we have examples of systems that are hosted in the US, and our privacy commissioner is satisfied with the terms that we have with that vendor in the US, that the security and privacy is safeguarded. That's a trade-off that the politicians make. Do they want it done cheaper, faster, better in the US, and then have it being raised in the House or in the media around the privacy of Ontarians being subject to secret warrants in the US? For the example that I'm talking about, that is a trade-off that they have made. I think with the example that Jeff gave with Shared Services Canada and the email, there absolutely is no consideration for any sovereignty outside of Canadian jurisdictions, including even network hops through Michigan or Minnesota. So I think there's a slightly different approach jurisdictionally sometimes that needs to get factored in as well. A longer decision process that will have to take place because there are multiple folks at the table, but certainly work underway, and lots of enthusiasm towards having a cross provincial jurisdiction perspective too.
Well, that's a great response. I'm just going to give you a couple of specific examples rather than a broad answer. I was involved with PSCIOC, and then there's the federal, provincial, territorial, and all those things. Those conversations are constantly happening. and looking at best practices and trying to share from each other, because as Samantha said, those decisions, if you make decisions together, it can take a long time, and you're crossing jurisdictions, so it's kind of like a bit of a moot point. It's just let's all try and do things as best as we can. However, there's some examples where there are active groups working together at multiple levels. The whole notion of open data and pushing, hopefully everybody's familiar with open data, but I mean, it's, if somebody puts something out on the web from your ministry or department and it's in a PDF, that's for people to read, not computers, right? If it's put out in an Excel spreadsheet or a database style and I can click on it and download it, then I can reinterpret it, put my own graphs, what have you. And Canada's been doing that with the weather data forever. So more and more open data is coming out, and people are working at some of the highest benefit of that is city level. Got city services like garbage, potholes, graffiti, all kinds of great information people that affect people's lives. As you go up, provinces and the government are actually working together on open data plans. And the last one is the web. As we worked on the new web standard, we at the federal government worked on the new web standards for usability, great web experience, better websites, more accessible to a broader people with disabilities. We worked on that with Ontario government, and we worked on, as we were developing the standards, and we worked with the Australian government and with the Five Nations CIO Council, which was included Britain and the UK and New Zealand as well. And out of that came something called the WET, W-E-T, the Web Experience Toolkit. And it is a remarkable development because, first of all, it's all kinds of accessible, usable scripts for mobile, all different platforms. It's wide open. It is not Crown copyright. It is actually the MIT, but it's a very, very open license provision so that it can be shared and used by private sector. People can contribute to it. It's an open website. You can find it if you look the WET Toolkit on Google. And the encouragement of that team of the federal government who are overseeing that is more scripts, more things. What about SharePoint? What about Drupal? What about all these other technologies? Let's get everybody in to share their best practices across all levels of government. And what we're finding in the federal government now is more and more of these things are coming out that are not Crown copyright. They're open license for sharing and working in multi-jurisdictions. So that's a really great example of everybody having worked together, having one place where they all share and work on something.
Could I pick up on this a little bit and maybe start by asking Michael this? Because one of the things I'm grappling with, and I think I'm hearing this, is the cloud obviously provides opportunity, it obviously provides risk, but I'm trying to get a sense of to what degree you think it is a driver of the kind of change we're talking about, whether it's interjurisdictional or transformational organizations, or is simply an enabler. And I think there's a difference. For me, a driver is, okay, because it's there, it's going to force change to happen. The other is a little softer, saying, well, if it's there, then maybe it's easier. I mean, can you see, based on this, just a question at the back of the room, is use of the cloud going to drive this kind of intergovernmental collaboration, or?
No, I think absolutely. It has great opportunity for that to occur. Clearly, it's an enabler, but I think it's also about, I think one of the last points I was making there was, I think we are going to see it's going to transform how business is conducted, and I think this is one example within the government sphere of how that can occur. There's no question that with cloud, it enables you to think about and to do some things in entirely different ways. You can do those for efficiency reasons, you can do those for others. I think pretty clearly cloud is going to not just enable, but actually drive that transformation.
In essence, Samantha, that's a strategic question, isn't it? To what degree you want to use it to drive the kind of transformation you refer to, the kind of change that we need to have in government? Or again, to what degree it is an investment in just making life be better and in some way an enabler?
I think so, absolutely. But I think we've got to be thinking about the driver in unintended ways too. So as cloud becomes ubiquitous, as we all become familiar with using different aspects of software as a service, we're doing that in ways that require a response. that requires a response, because that's a risk that isn't being properly assessed or mitigated from an organizational perspective. So as we have more folks doing that kind of thing, we need to be thinking about how that's driving a response from government. So it isn't necessarily always the opportunity, it's sometimes the unintended consequences of the ubiquity of cloud that forces a response.
Jeff, any thoughts?
Just that, I think it's a driver. I think it's a driver because everybody's just saying, I'm frustrated, pissed off, somewhere in that continuum. I think I'm paying too much. I think I'm, I go down to Best Buy and I can get this for $10, and I'm paying $100,000 a month for my stuff. Like, come on.
You don't know Jeff. Every Saturday he's in Best Buy buying something.
So I think that people are saying, okay, fine. I've had to reduce my department in size. I've had to reduce my budget. There's this great big deficit. I have fewer people. They're working harder. And so I just don't believe these prices type of thing. I know we're oversimplifying it, but I think we all kind of feel that we expect. I don't care if you're the cluster leader or the Shared Services Canada. I want a better deal. I want it cheaper. I know you guys. You may have a different mandate than I do in my department, but let's all get on the same page here. I think it's a driver.
Yeah, as part of the driver, though, clearly, we've identified multiple considerations and challenges that will occur. And one of them, I think you just hit on a really strong one, Jeff, is this whole consumerization of IT. And with that, there's a set of expectations that people have that force this to be a driver. There's also, I think, a set of things that they don't really think about sometimes. There is a reason why, there may be some bad reasons why, to use your example, it's $100,000 for one thing, and I can go to Best Buy to get another. But there probably are some other reasons why that's the case, because what you and I as consumers are willing to accept, and in some cases don't even know we accept with regard to things like risk and that sort of thing. Example, sending that file off through Gmail. Probably the person doing that is doing it for appropriate reasons, yet they're not thinking about the issues. But with that comes a whole set of considerations, and it's an interesting world we live in right now, because the consumerization of IT is causing us to rethink how we do things, to try to do things even faster than we're doing them, and that's not just true of cloud. Certainly the whole mobile computing phenomena is a very good example of that. Once again, what we require in support of government, and what businesses require in support of business may be quite different than what you and I are on the street as consumers of all of this new technology. And so with that, there's going to be a lot of other considerations.
I agree, Mike, but I just think it comes down to transparency. Like, you really feel frustrated when your service provider isn't fully transparent on what those loaded up costs.
Oh, absolutely. Couldn't agree more with that. Absolutely.
I have a question in the first table here.
So I just wanted to extend what folks have been saying, and actually, I think the drivers are actually not just going to be coming from the consumerization among those of us who are public sector employees, but a driver is actually going to come from the citizens, because they're going to see the kinds of things that the cloud-enabled businesses, et cetera, is going to be capable of doing, and they're going to expect the same from government. And I don't think actually that we have the luxury of saying that we're going to take a long trajectory to adapt to this, because I don't think we have that luxury, because I think the pressure is going to come from the citizens, who really are our stakeholders and our shareholders, right? And so it's going to come from there, and it's going to come against the politicians, which will then translate to the pressure for us to be better, faster, and we have to adapt to it. So that's what I think. That's the driver. In addition to the questions about supplier transparency and costs.
So for the benefit of people in the back of the room, perhaps didn't hear, the comment is that the real driver here is going to be the citizen, but really sees all the benefits and will expect no less. And I think that part of that message too is that government doesn't move fast, it's going to be left behind. I will ask the future speakers just stand up and speak loudly. Any comment though from the
I think there's a balance there, so I think that's absolutely true. The citizen, the consumer is going to, the expectations are going to drive. But the citizen also expects that there's a provision for safeguarding privacy too. So it's being able to balance that, I want it cheaper, I want it faster, against the, but I expect you as government to be absolutely upholding my, my privacy and making sure that there isn't a risk that you're taking that's contravening my, provisions underneath the Privacy Act. And that's tough, because it's we could absolutely go to Amazon tomorrow and post all of our stuff there, but that probably wouldn't be the best, best thing from a privacy or security perspective. So I think it's a really tough line to draw. Individuals making their own risk assessments don't do that the same as organizations, and that's where the trade-off is. And I think ultimately it becomes a trade-off. Do you want things faster, better, cheaper? Or do you want to make sure that you're doing that within the constraints around privacy and security? Or both.
Anyone else want to pick up on that? We have a comment from the young lady back there. Could you stand up, please?
Melissa Tullio with Government Services. I'm actually with the unit that's really interested in the transformational aspect, the Center for Innovation and Workplace Culture. So I guess my comment / question comes from that place where I'm looking at it as a sort of transformational, cloud computing as a transformational aspect of what's happening in the ODS. And I fully appreciate the privacy and security concerns, but just as cloud computing has a continuum, so there's that private and data center that will always be in government, just like Sam alluded to. But there's also the public aspect, like Ontario.ca, which is now hosted on Drupal. So you have to look at the full continuum. And I guess my question is, I'm sure this is an ongoing process. It's mostly to Sam, but also a bit to Jeff. The classification of data. So that's a really important gray area. So that person who sends a presentation to their Gmail account, you know, if you look at the data that they sent, it's obviously you don't want individuals to make that call. It should be organizations making that call, you know, sending that to a private email account. But if you look at the type of information that's sent, is there any sort of interpretation there where if it's a low sensitivity kind of document, you know, it's not a big deal. But if it's a high sensitivity, then it is a big deal. Is there any sort of gray area there where you can sort of make that judgment call on an individual basis, or is it always that this thou shalt not and that's it, can't do it? And I guess sidebar comment to that is that if you have a VPN, you're always in that private behind the firewall thing. So it's also that also comes down to the tools that we have access to. So the fact that I do have telework privileges and I do have access to VPN, it is in a secure place, and I can access that stuff on the weekend when I need to. So that's a sort of sidebar comment.
So to answer the question, is there a gray area? I think the answer is no. We have appropriate use of assets policy that governs how we use things. The practice is maybe a little bit different than the policy, and that's where I think the gray area happens. We do need to classify data. The security considerations in using a tool like Gmail and sending stuff by Gmail aren't just the nature of the data and how that might be available, but it's the potential for vulnerability into the government network across that kind of more public domain. So there are perhaps security considerations that an individual with the best of intentions may not be aware of that we've got to safeguard against as well. And I think that has to be forefront. Where it gets a little tricky on the data classification side, and I'll give an example of this. As we started the work on the release of the RFP on the web hosted stuff, when we looked at some of our websites, and it's all public record, and it's all low sensitivity, there is subscription services available through some of the websites where you're required to put an email account in. An email account is actually personally identifiable information. So from a classification perspective, that actually bumps it up into medium sensitivity, which requires it being treated a little bit differently. So on the surface, it tends to look fairly straightforward. When you dig a little bit, there can be different provisions that have to be made based on a case-by-case interpretation. So gray areas there are absolutely. Policy tries to define so that there isn't a gray area, but I think that's what we're in right now. And as the expectations change, I think the transformation is going to come when there is more strategic thought given to what the direction needs to be.
just briefly, I don't want to make your question backfire on me. However, everybody who works for the government doesn't just sign a thing that they will and do understand, like values and ethics and what have you. And we are all supposed to understand what's a cabinet confidence, so we don't like blurt it out. And you are supposed to understand what's personal information, and so you don't share it, right? And it's actually stunning how many people are learning about Facebook the hard way, you know. Oops, you know, but the year of my birth, you know, stuff like that. I didn't think it was a big deal, but it is, right? So, you know, there's a bunch of discretion that you should be using kind of anyway. Even if you're not following in practice the right process, you really shouldn't be taking stuff home or sending stuff home that is incredibly sensitive, and you really should know what it is.
Samantha, though, you had said in your presentation that implementation would be disruptive, and you had actually referred to the notion of a culture change regarding data classification. Are you saying that it's a matter of sort of better understanding, as you both have indicated among employees, about what this means, or is there more to it than that? Where do you see it on the kind of continuum of implementation?
I see the thin end of the wedge on the disruptive side being at the application side, so not at the individual level and the individual's treatment of data and how they manage that and use tools. I think that will kind of happen and is governed by operating policy and some of the provisions that we all sign off on as public service. But when we think about our application portfolio in government, we've got a bunch of stuff that's older, it's probably not well documented, and we really don't understand the data that we have in there in terms of classification perspective. And I think that gets back to Mike's point. This is going to require, for us to use cloud properly, a fundamental reassessment of our application workload and a treatment of that application workload then based on that understanding of what we have and how it can be treated differently with the different cloud offerings. So I think that's where we're going to see the disruption, is around the owners of data that sits in applications right now, assessing that, understanding that, and then figuring out the disposition of that from a cloud perspective based on that assessment.
We have a question at the back there, please.
It's James Cornish, Criminal Law Division. So I've got a different kind of business than most people in the room, but I think everybody here has a push on of transformation, which is variously defined, depending on who's talking about. But we also have, you probably, folks in the room probably have similar relationships with collaborators. Ours are the police. The police see transformation as an opportunity to save money. And the push is to go electronic for what they feed us, which are files. We're having massive, there's going to be a massive influx of small files and a small influx of massive files. And so going back to what we're talking about, I was just at Apple and I bought a terabyte for 125 bucks. We need storage space predominantly for this influx. And I'm interested in knowing when, these three benefits of cloud, the main one is cheaper, when that will come to pass for the private cloud. Any predictions? Because right now it's not, it's out of reach.
Well, I can tell you from our own experience inside IBM, we are certainly using cloud, and it is reducing our costs significantly. Now, I have to be careful here. Again, this whole thing with the consumerization of IT gives us, as consumers, a set of functionality and perhaps a price point that is really unrealistic with regard to any large enterprise, because the requirements are quite different whether we think about it or not. That terabyte you bought from Apple is not at all, doesn't provide any of the availability and other sorts of considerations that you would expect for the hosting of your own data inside the Ontario government. So, I think we have to be careful. But I know one of the things that we've done, we've produced a cloud that's allowed us to do something that has been talked about and done in certain areas for a while, called tiering, storage tiering. And the whole idea behind storage tiering is putting your data where it needs to be at any point in time, sort of right tiering it. And in what you do with tiering is you'll have a set of
you'll have a set of storage that's very high performance and probably pretty expensive. And you'll have a hierarchy of storage on down to something that may not perform very well, or not nearly as well as that high performing stuff, but it's a lot less expensive. And then the key is knowing where to put stuff where, when, and being able to do that pretty rapidly and moving stuff all the time. The cloud that we produced does that in an automated fashion, does the analysis on it, and constantly moves data in a non-disruptive fashion up and down this hierarchy. And it's resulted in us being able to reduce the price per call unit, whatever you might like, terabyte, gigabyte, etc., price per unit of storage in half. And that's something that we haven't been able to do before. And it came with the ability to do all the other stuff you'd expect to do with cloud, including rapid provisioning and deprovisioning of that storage. I think mechanisms like that do exist, and I think you're going to see more and more of those that come as a byproduct of the cloud environment. Now, along the way, storage is getting cheaper, just as it got cheaper for you, your experience as a consumer at Apple. But that's kind of baked into that for us. But being able to reduce that by 50% was no small thing.
And I think that that will be the case in Ontario too, but it gets back to why is our current model so expensive relative to where the new opportunities are? And it has tended to be because the highest specs drive the common service. So for that high sensitivity data that needs to sit on a rack inside a cage with an armed guard in front of it, everybody pays for that regardless of whether or not their application requires it. So as Mike said, that tiered storage requires that you assess what your needs are from a disaster recovery availability perspective, as well as how that information needs to be safeguarded in the raised floor space. So it will absolutely be cheaper for those that can avail themselves of that opportunity. But if it requires that security at that level that the justice systems tend to do, that will drive cost. Being able to differentiate though and not make everything that highest common denominator is, I think, where the promise of cheaper is.
Right.
Yes.
Just a bridge to your point, Samantha, though, that it's not just about...
Sorry, can I please stand up, speak to the back room in here?
Good morning. I was just going to say, I work with IBM, and I was just going to say that one of the issues that we run into, though, is the government, to some degree at times, looks for, you want to kind of have your cake and eat it too. I want the cheap and cheerful, I want the Gmail solution, but by the same token, I want service level agreements that give me sub-second response time. I want unlimited liability for breach. I want, and so I'm not trying to be critical, but the issue becomes those things, each time you ask for service levels with sub-second response time and 7x24 availability, Gmail is free because there's no service levels associated with Gmail. If Gmail is down, you don't get money back from Google because you didn't pay anything for it in the first place. So it's the same sort of thing, and it's the same thing that David Nichols' team wrestles with day in and day out, and we wrestle with the same things. If you want to have service level agreements in place that give you the kind of service levels you want, those things cost money, whether you buy them from a vendor or whether you get them from the IT organization. And the same thing with terms and conditions. If you want to have unlimited liability for a breach, the vendors and the IT organization need to cost that in. What does that cost if there's a breach? So anyway, it's an interesting trade-off, and it's a lot of fun for us to be involved with it.
But also picking up on that, I mean, the consumerization is one thing, but as Samantha has said, I mean, as an organization, the government has to consider certain issues such as security and privacy.
And I think the government, for the most part, the government does a good job of it, but it's always finding that balance.
We have a question at the very back.
Yeah. So one of my concerns is I get the motto, it's cheaper, faster, better. And one of my concerns whenever I'm talking with different stakeholders in terms of the cloud is how much of that cheaper, faster, better applies to a jurisdiction like Ontario versus international companies or products that need to distribute the same service internationally. And so I think one of the things that would be helpful, I guess it's a question, is what kind of methodologies will you use to communicate, and in what ways it will be cheaper as opposed to other national or international models in a jurisdiction like this? And exactly in the scope that you showed between private and public, to show that point for different types of sensitivity where that no longer is the case. So where it is no longer cheaper because of the things that you have to add on to it. So I don't know, I guess the question in summary is, how will you be able to communicate this on a complex topic like a cloud so that people can actually make decisions day to day on it?
Jeff, we'll start.
All right, I love this question. So,
Thanks, Jeff.
first of all, the government's not really good. Governments talk about they're going to transform something to save money. In my experience, any change is a net increase in money. It's the weirdest thing, right? Like whether it's pick anything, shut the gun registry down. You know, like, my big panic was they weren't going to shut the gun registry down. They're going to modify it to simplify it, which means we could spend more money, right? But we get into this whole thing of not identifying the savings and working towards them. Right now, there's some things about Shared Services Canada. They took over 43 departments. So what is that? That's a net increase in spend. Right now, we've got one management team overseeing 43, with 43 infrastructures, with 43 different service management processes, and on and on and on and on, right? So somewhere you have to have a strategy to get to the vision. And the whole idea is, what can I commoditize? The craziest thing about better, faster, cheaper is, you know, okay, I didn't start in 1910. I learned coding.
Forget about that.
But I did go to Waterloo in the 70s, and I did take computer science, and in the good old days of the computer, we were better, faster, cheaper. It was called time sharing. Nobody had their own computer. There was great big computers that ran everything you could imagine that every department or ministry needed, right? Or every aspect of the company. And you got the resources as you needed them. You paid for them when you got them, and you gave them up, and somebody else had them. True multi-tenancy is what we're calling it now. It's crazy, isn't it? So then the PC was invented, and all went to hell in a handbasket, right? So now, if you want to run a PeopleSoft or SAP or Siebel or, you know, pick any application, the architecture of the computers changed to one box for one thing, right? Now we're heading back towards the good old days of well-designed mainframe. My friend here from IBM. Because now we have VMware and we can virtualize, right? So now we're starting to mature and head towards that you can actually allocate resources in a computing environment based on demand. So the fellow from criminal justice, if he has a short burst of stuff, theoretically his shared service provider could sell him at a reasonable cost, fully loaded with all the service levels and whatever, for a short period of time or a given period of time at a much, much, much lower cost than saying, oh, well, I gotta go buy all those disks for you. We still have that, I gotta buy all those disks for you and load them up and give them security service level mentality. The more we can start commoditizing the underlying layer, then you can start to hand out, give back, and you have that elasticity. Because right now I'm very skeptical that there's any such thing as a private cloud, all due respect to Mike, right? Because I'm still buying the resources for the customers I have, right? So, I mean, what's the economy of scale, right? It's only when I start to be able to hand them out and give them back as a commodity and have lots of different tenants or departments or ministries or whatever, then I can have flexible resources. So that, I mean, that's my that's where you get better coverage.
Thoughts?
So I think I want to move us away from the notion of cheaper, because it won't always be cheaper. And I think when we talk about it in those terms, we're boxing ourselves into a corner. It's only going to be cheaper if we can take advantage of some of those opportunities around the dynamic provisioning and the pay-as-you-go, and only for those service specs that we've agreed to. So if it is the top spec requirement for the sub-second response time, the availability 24/7, 365 days a year, the full disaster recovery, the hot backup, it's not going to be any cheaper than it is today. We provision that today and do that fairly well. If it is pay-as-you-go, if it is on demand, then that's a little bit different, and we need to be talking about that a little bit differently. So I think we need to be speaking about service specifications and a menu of different options that can be provisioned dynamically, and think about what those pricing and service expectations related to that are. But I think if we talk about cheaper as a definitive, then we're going to get ourselves into problems, because we're going to be asked how much cheaper and when. And I don't think we can say that without understanding what the specific requirements are.
Michael?
I absolutely agree with what both Samantha and Jeff have said. The reality around cost of cloud is it can be cheaper, it may not be. And it really does depend on a lot of variables. It depends on which of the service models you're using, whether it's software as a service, whether it's infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. Very much depends on the deployment model. If I can go to a public cloud provider, you know, a credit card type like an Amazon, and they can meet all of my requirements, it will likely be cheaper than if I'm just hosting that workload myself. The key in what I just said is if they can meet all my requirements. For government, very often security is going to be one of the biggest ones. Availability is going to be a big one. Can you get a service level agreement? All of the other things that we've talked about. So, you know, you may in fact be able to come up with cases where it's cheaper, absolutely, by using a public provider, but that if it meets your requirements part is one of the things you have to consider. If you say, okay, for me, I need to use a private model in some variant, whether I, as an organization, host it myself, or I go to a vendor who hosts it, but it's still private, that may still save me some money, because I'm now sharing a service potentially that I may have hosted on an individual basis previously. That's a good thing, but I can guarantee you it won't be as cheap, it won't save as much money as a public cloud, but that one may meet my requirements. So, I mean, these answers are all, it depends, really depends on the combination of what your requirements are, really fully looked at, versus these various other combinations. And the other thing you have to think about in some cases is what's your starting point. If I'm starting from scratch with a new application, the cloud is more than likely in any of these combinations going to be a better model to use than traditional hosting. And it's going to most likely save me some amount of money versus what traditional hosting would. But if I am already hosted and I have to move it, kind of to Jeff's point, it's going to change costs. It's going to cause costs to go up. It may not cause my operating ongoing costs to go up, but it will almost certainly cost me some amount of money to move to the cloud to begin with. So it really depends on where you're coming from as well. I find in many cases, if you look at people who have a particular application that they've already done a really nice job of using, say, virtualization and some of the other optimization techniques on it, and they want to move it to a private cloud environment, depending on how much sharing they're doing with others and willing to do with others, that one may not save them much money at all.
We have time for a couple more questions. Anything from the floor? Could I ask one perhaps? Jeff had talked about governance, and I'm interested in both the Ontario and IBM experience, I guess. You have these huge organizations. You are moving forward on this kind of, on this transformation through the cloud. How do you, what's the governance arrangements? How do you deal with, in Ontario's case, I guess it's departments, clients, however you define them internally. Perhaps in IBM, we're talking about your various organizations across the world. I mean, this must be more than just, okay, this is what we're going to do. How have you set, what kind of structures and processes did you have to set up, or are you setting up? Could you start, Samantha?
Sure. I think anytime you talk about governance, everybody kind of shudders and thinks, oh, it's more process, that's going to take longer, and it's going to require more decision making. It's going to mean that we move away from the opportunities around the dynamic provisioning and the faster time to market. But it's absolutely true. So we need to be, and in Ontario we are, using some of the frameworks that we already have in place to guide decision making at the right level. So in terms of disposition from a privacy and security perspective, the ISPC classification system, we absolutely need to use that. And that kind of sets the bar for how we treat things. Business executives make the decisions on what their needs are. They engage with their CIOs typically to talk about what the technology solution might look like. That role and that relationship doesn't fundamentally change. How the CIO might broker differently across a different service chain will be different. Whether the business executive sees that or not, or sees it just in terms of time to market or different cost profile, that's something that I think is a bit of an art and a science.
But then in terms of your office, have you kind of left that relationship to the CIO, or do you need to have those quote-unquote business executives at some point around your table?
So there are corporate directives and corporate governance that sits over top of that, just to make sure that it's happening properly. It's more of an oversight perspective. So it's not intruding in the relationship. It's making sure that that's happening under the rules that it's already in place.
Right.
Yeah, in IBM, I can say we actually have a luxury that I find few do. We're a very large, complex company. We operate in over 170 countries around the world. We have one CIO, and that CIO reports to the CEO, essentially. And with that, the CEO and the CEO's senior vice president that run each of the major divisions of business units at IBM are all pretty much in alignment about how we're going to use IT as well. And with that comes, again, I think a luxury that many don't have. I know when I talk to customers, I find that that's seldom the case. From that, we've driven a set of standards which I suspect are similar to the ISPC you were referring to, including an enterprise architecture that we agree to be used internally that helps to kind of govern some of the things. And then when we get down to a project in the solution level, we have a set of standard reviews that we go through, and we have governance boards, architecture review councils that are in place to enforce the standards and to ensure that those standards are enforced. That's true for pretty much every information technology project and solution that we do, including all of the clouds there too.
And by the way, just for Samantha, if memory serves, IBM used to have 91
yeah,
CIOs.
actually, we claim even more than that.
Yeah, you brought them down to 1.
Right. Yeah, that's part of the transformation. Now, we went through a near-death experience in the late 1990s.
Just like the government of Canada is.
Yes. And as a part of that, we got a lot of incentive to reduce cost. And one of the places that we saw tremendous inefficiency was in information technology.
Any more questions? Well, look, just before I say formal and final thanks both to all of you for coming and to our guests, I just want to tell you one thing that is coming up. Next Wednesday on the 21st of November at noon, there is a free webinar that Canadian Government Executive is hosting looking at managed print services. And it's in a sense picking up on this kind of theme, essentially saying that if you think about how managed print services work, if you do it strategically, you can save up to 20% of your costs in terms of not only hardware, such as photocopiers and printers, but also use of paper and the like. So if you're interested in learning more about this, there is no cost. It is absolutely free. Go to the Canadian Government Executive website, and all you need to do is register, however. And it is at between noon and 1 on November 21st, next Wednesday. Secondly, out there are some, obviously, versions of the magazine you can take, and we have there a book for sale called Smart Trust by Stephen Covey, who we have worked with many times, and I think might be useful and helpful to you. Finally, I need to say thank you to IBM for making this session possible. I need to say thank you to our 3 guests, Michael, Samantha, and Jeff, who I think have given us a very rich overview and given us lots to think about. And finally, I want to say again, thank you to you all for coming.
So thank you very, very much for all the time and effort this evening.
And we're good to go. Thanks again.